This is Matthew McAtee,
Leonardo Salazar, and
John Mays.
and we are interviewing Edward Carroll.
so Edward, what is your age and where were you born?
I'm 82 years old. I was born in Milwaukee, and I have lived in this area ever since.
So which was your first neighborhood that you lived in and who lived with you?
My first neighborhood was the Merrill Park neighborhood, which is centered around Merrill Park, located on 35th Street between St. Paul and Michigan. And in our family were my two sisters. Mary was a couple of years old, 3 years older than me, and Roseanne was 1 year older than me. That only lasted until we got older, and when we got into our 20s, I became the oldest of the children, and they, of course, were much younger, being somewhat vain. Our grandmother also lived with us, another Mary Carroll, and that would, of course, be all based upon the fact that my parents lived there. My father's name was Linus Carroll, and my mother was Harriet Carroll.
What were their occupations?
My dad was a bookkeeper, and he worked, through my childhood, he was working with a couple of packing houses. The one that he spent the most time at was Equity Livestock, and that was a cooperative. Number of farmers had contracts with the cooperatives so that they would sell their animals there when it was time for them to be slaughtered. And the co-op operated the slaughtering plant, and the animals would be slaughtered. The records would be kept as to what was the weight of the animal, what was the weight of the meat that was obtained from it, and that was my father's bailiwick. And as a matter of fact, my mother worked there briefly, which is how they met. And once they were married, he moved back in with his parents. Unfortunately, his father, my grandfather, died shortly after that, and I never met him. And then my sisters and I were born. My grandmother continued to live with us until the day she died.
Did you have any, you said your mother worked with your dad. What was her, you said she was a homemaker?
She was a homemaker for most of her career. She worked briefly for a silversmith, and the idea of plating particularly religious vessels, chalices, ciporia, would be part of what they did, as a matter of fact, a major part of their business. Then she moved from there to the Equity Co-op and met my father, and shortly thereafter they got married, and she retired and took up the occupation of homemaker for the rest of her life.
And as a homemaker, what kinds of things did she do?
She took care of the house, and she took care of us, made sure that we were neat and clean as we went to wherever we were going, that we were fed, that we had decent clothes to wear, and a decently clean place to sleep. She took care of us.
Go ahead.
Did you have any nicknames growing up?
No, it was kind of painful because my one aunt insisted on calling me Eddie, even as I went through the troublesome teenage years where, oh, you don't want these adults saying things that will embarrass you as a teenager. And she called me Eddie, and I could not break her of that because by that time I had become the lordly Ed, and I insisted on that as my name. Well, it still is. And unfortunately, my aunt is no longer with us. And if I could have her come back, because she was a dear, and call me Eddie one more time, it would help.
So other than English, do you know any other languages?
No, I don't. I know a few words in various languages. I took 2 years of German in college, and so I should have some ability. As a matter of fact, I did survive a conversation via telephone with a client representative in Bonn, Germany, and we managed to, with his broken English and my substandard German, to understand each other and had a conversation. We're able to figure out what we were going to do with his problem. I was an analytical chemist, and we dealt with the situation. I did also talk to a gentleman in Cali, Colombia, where I was able to tell him simply I was going to surrender and that I did not speak Spanish. Did he, by the grace of God, speak English? And yes, he did. So we got along just fine, but I was grateful that I didn't have to try to call up the few words that I knew.
Do you wish you would have learned more about the language or no?
Yes, I do. I wish I could have taken the time, trouble, and initiative to go ahead and actually learn at least one foreign language. It's something that we in the United States are, in our arrogance, quite cavalier about, that we expect everyone else to speak English. And if you speak slowly and loudly enough, they will understand you. It's a terrible attitude, but we do it.
What stopped you from pursuing that?
Inertia, laziness, the fact that I got involved with many other things, and especially family.
Some other things such as?
Such as getting through college. I graduated with a degree in chemistry and a degree in mathematics, and going on with the music teaching that I was still doing at that time, and shortly after that, getting married, having children to take care of, and other more serious jobs to pursue.
And as a music teacher, what kind of instruments did you teach, and at what age?
I taught accordion. I started teaching at the age of 16. I got involved in it because a group of the people where my father worked had children who were involved in various talent skills, and or some of the people themselves, more often as musicians, were also willing to perform in public. And the younger people included a Spanish dancer, an acrobatic dancer, a tap dancer, a singer or two or three, and the orchestra included a steel guitar, a violin, a piano, a drum, and I don't know, one or two others. And we also had a couple of accordion players besides myself who did a solo number in every show, or actually a duet. And I was the master of ceremonies, which again involved my father as a writer. And it was a fun time and something that we all enjoyed doing very much. Back in the day, there were a lot of clubs, primarily for men, that were formed in every major town and city in the United States. So you had Lions Clubs, there were the Odd Fellows, the Kiwanis. I still don't know what a Kiwani is. But there were moose and elk and all of these clubs had an avowed purpose, which was to raise money with various types of fundraisers and to donate it to the poor, the elderly, the orphans, and other people who needed their help. Hospitals were a favored place to go. They all did valuable service to the community. And their other purpose, which they didn't tell you about, was it was an opportunity to go to a meeting at least once a month and get away from their wives for a little while, and then perhaps even go to a convention. But this has pretty much faded with the fact that there are apparently quite a number of places that people can go for help, that the institutionalized old people's homes, as run by the government, have strangely gone to private enterprise, whereas some of the other functions that were at the time charitable have gone to the government. So things move on. Anyhow, they were amongst the places that we entertained, and that it was not unusual for us to put on a show at an Elks Club or at a Lions Club and entertain their members. It was also not unusual for us to put on a show at an orphan asylum or at an old folks' home. And in some cases, we even got paid. Not we as the performers, but we as the group, which would mean then that we could upgrade our public address system, and that we could even perhaps help some of the performers with the cost of their costumes. So it was more a thing that we did because we were ourselves providing the service of entertaining these groups, and also that we just had an enormous amount of fun doing it.
And what kinds of things did you do in performing in those clubs and events?
Well, the whole group did it was a kind of a Western themed show. And there was a distinction in those days between the term country and Western, as it is used now, is a combination, but there was Western style music and Sons of the Pioneer, Cool Water, songs of that nature, which I'm probably drawing a blank, as opposed to the country songs where you lose your dog, your wife cheats on you, your truck breaks down. And the topics are a little different, but it has now come together, and it's the Western style music has pretty much disappeared, and country has been affected by the other common and more popular genres, and it still exists, but it's not the as strong as it once was, and as distinctive and separate as it once was. But in any event, the instruments that we had, the steel guitar was something that fit the country genre very nicely. The singing could be canted in that direction. The commentary that was given during the show was going to be in a down-home style also, and the whole thing was kind of dragged into kicking and screaming into the Western and country.
Mr. John Moyler, you have a visitor at the security desk. Mr. John Moyler, you have a visitor at the security desk.
Was all drawn into the country and Western style, even though none of us was legitimately either a Westerner or a country person.
And what was your most memorable show that you performed, or biggest?
With that group, we never did anything that was all that very large. There was another group I got involved with, and that was the Lo Duca Brothers accordion company, and that was where I was a music teacher. And there was a progression of bands in their organization. Kid just starting out taking music lessons would get put into the beginner band, and then it would go up to more and more skill being required, more and more experience, more and more difficult songs being played by that band. And there were 6 bands, which gave the scope that would be necessary so that a concert could be put on featuring each of those bands and some occasional acts in between that were used both to vary the type of entertainment being given to the crowd and also cover the fact that we had to get one band off the stage and another band onto the stage so that the show could go on. And I got involved in that one as doing a stand-up comedy routine, which my father had written for me. And it cast me as sort of a tough kid, which I wasn't. I was the smallest kid in my class and pretty much stayed out of the way of anybody who was going to give me any trouble. But I would wear a little makeup. I had a black eye. And as my relatives saw the picture of me having done my performance and standing there with a black eye, they were all horrified. This can't be our nephew. This can't be our grandson, a street kid. Well, in any event, what I delivered was a combination of some face facts. They were dad jokes. They were written by my dad. What can I say? But they went over quite well because the audience was also full of dads and their kids on the stage, and they were in a mood to appreciate anything. We got a chance. We were invited, as a matter of fact, to do a part of our concert at the Washington Park Band Shell, which was at the time a premier location for various entertainments at that time. Washington Park was the site of the zoo. The Milwaukee County Zoo was located there at Washington Park, which is at about 39th and Vliet, or Lisbon. And the zoo moved out to where it is at the present time, and that was a great loss to us because where I lived, which was on 35th Street, just north of the viaduct, north of the expressway now, I-94 runs east-west past our location. And where I lived cannot be saved for history because the house was torn down and replaced by a gas station. And that gas station has since been closed down too, so there's absolutely nothing going on. But Merrill Park was a nice neighborhood. It was a mixed neighborhood ethnically that we had American Indians, African Americans, a few Hispanics, a few Asians, and oh yeah, a lot of Irish. And that would be my category. And in any event, back to Washington Park, which was therefore within actually walking distance of our home. We would go there for the lagoon, where you could rent a boat and a pair of oars and paddle about for an hour for some ridiculously low price that I don't remember what it was, but you don't get to do anything. I think it was something like 30 cents an hour. And in addition to the attraction of the lagoon and the possibility of having a picnic there, there was then the zoo and there was the band shell, which was home to any number of other entertainments besides our little foray on the 4th of July. The police estimated that crowd that gathered and that I therefore got the privilege of entertaining was 20,000 people. And that's the biggest group I ever got to work with, for. And the concerts that were done on an annual basis, because playing music yourself was a big thing yet in those days. When we got married, my wife and I had a group play for us at our wedding reception, who were all friends of mine because they too had been teachers at the same music school. And it was the common thing at that time to have a live band for a wedding. And if you had come up with the idea that, oh yeah, we're going to have a DJ for our wedding, we would look at you as if you were from another planet and ask, what does that mean? What's a DJ? Well, that's a guy who spins records and plays whatever you want. And we would be mystified by it if that had ever turned up, because he plays the record player. What a skill. Everybody learned a musical instrument. They may not have learned it to a great enough degree of skill to be able to perform publicly, but it was a common thing to be able to play a piano somewhat, to be able to play a violin somewhat, to be able to play an accordion, to be able to play drums, to be able to play a guitar. It is something that unfortunately doesn't happen that much these days, that there are only a few people that, only a low percentage of people that do that. And there are too many other opportunities for entertainment, and people reach for those. And I have, as I have remarked to you in our previous conversations, come to a point where I love so much to hear myself talk that I go on, and I've really lost the thread of where we started all of this. And if you could bring me back to where we were, I'll go on for another half hour.
Okay, so you said music was how you met your wife. Can you explain how that happened? Yes.
And it is a story that I used to tell with one response, and I tell now and get an entirely different response. That I and the group that I played with were playing a wedding. There were three of us. It was a strange combo. I don't think I ever either heard or took part in a group that was an accordion, a trumpet, and a drummer. But I had enough repertoire that most of what people would ask for, I could play. The trumpet had a collection of music that he did play, but if he were to put up a song list, it would probably have been a couple of hundred long, whereas I would have probably been able to bring out music and play something I had never looked at before, a piece of music that was completely strange to me, and didn't matter, I could play it. One of my other combos that I played with, there was a guitar player who had been a teacher at the same school where I was, and both of us worked on that basis. We never once had a rehearsal. We just decided, okay, we're going to play. He had the gig, as I think I mentioned, where we were going to play the same tavern 3 nights a week for the whole summer, and paid off a semester of tuition at Marquette University. So in any event, we played that wedding, and so the trumpeter was married, the drummer was married, and we noted, as we always noted who was on the other side of the bandstand, that there was a very attractive young woman there, and the drummer and the trumpet player both challenged me to meet her, to chat her up and get to know her. And I was a bit on the shy side, but I found myself forced because these two guys were behind me. And so I walked up to her and said hello, and we talked for a while. And unfortunately, the band only gets a short break and has to go back to work. And when we went back to work, we continued for some time, and she had come as a kindness to her neighbor who did not have an escort. She was an older lady, and my wife, to-be, Beverly, had taken her to the wedding, and the two of them had a good time, and then they went home. And we had not come to another break. So what I had been able to pick up in the very few minutes that I got to talk to her was all I had. And I learned that her name was Beverly, did not pick up a last name, and that she had gone to South Division High School. So with that, I went to South Division High School, and I sweet-talked the secretary into letting me look through some of the back annuals. And I knew that both of us were not that far out from high school, that I wouldn't have to look at a lot of annuals. And so I paged through the senior section of it, and I found her picture. And with that, I got her last name. Fortunately, it was an uncommon last name, and I only had to try a few phone calls. Back in the day, we had what you call a phone book, and it had the names in alphabetical order of everybody who had a phone in the city of Milwaukee and surroundings. And you could look them up, and that is exactly what I did. And so I called. I had to try 3 or 4, and they would be within the range of South Division High School. And when I did finally succeed in getting her, we had a nice talk. And I had a wedding to go to that coming Saturday, and I asked if she would accompany me, and she said yes. And 60 years later now, after 2 years of courtship, we have been married for 58 years. And when I told that story in the day, the response I always got was, "Oh, how romantic. Oh, your persistence really paid off. Oh, that was wonderful." Now when I tell that story, I get, "You stalked her. You are a stalker." And I guess I have to face it, that what I did hasn't changed, but the definition has.
Did she clarify you as a stalker or no?
Oh, good Lord, no. As far as she was concerned, she was happy to get the phone call, because as much as I had found that I liked her just in the just a few minutes that we talked, I had somehow or another managed to give an impression that she liked also. And I counted myself fortunate then, and I count myself fortunate now.
So, could you, before marriage, could you tell us about what your grade school was like?
Yes, I went to St. Rose of Lima grade school, which is on 30th and Clyburn. And it was the same location that my father had gone to grade school some 40 years ahead of me. And it was obviously a Catholic school, and we had 2 grades, two classes for each grade. So there were 2 first grades, 2 second grades, 2 third grades, with about 25 kids each. And so quite an enrollment. And we were taught by Dominican sisters. And we found that to be just expected. It was nothing to comment on, especially that, oh, all of our teachers are nuns. But again, this is back in the day. We are in the 1940s, primarily, and there were many of the sisters available, and most of them were teaching orders. So when I got out of grade school and went to Pius High School, it was Franciscan sisters that did most of the teaching. There were, by that time, some lay people involved, but the majority of our teachers were Franciscan sisters. And as opposed to in the grade school where it was 100% Dominican nuns. The stereotypes, as is the case with stereotypes in general, don't apply very well. For a student to get rapped on the knuckles with a ruler was an extreme rarity.
Did that happen to you ever?
Of course not.
No?
Once.
One.
But I would rather you didn't tell that to my grandson, who is a Marquette student. And, but yes, there was an opportunity to earn such a badge of honor, but one had to earn it. It was not something that happened every Tuesday afternoon. And it was not, therefore, a part of an important part of of my memories of the time. I think one of the more important parts probably would be 6th grade, where the sister who was teaching was getting older and was a little unfocused, and we would have had the opportunity to just run wild over her, and she would have been defenseless. And it is sometimes the spirit of a group, when they see somebody helpless, to rush in and kill them, punish them, not literally, of course. But it was our strange consideration that I, along with a group of other students, more or less independently, arrived at the conclusion that we didn't want to do that. And so every time she got lost on a topic that she didn't quite understand what she was trying to teach, one of us would take over. And if she had an arithmetic problem that she started doing on the blackboard, and it kind of got lost and she couldn't finish it, one of us would rush up to the board and finish it for her. If it was a question of reading and she couldn't pronounce a word, somebody would fill her in on it. And the whole thing was, therefore, that as a corporate group, those of us who were a little bit ahead of 6th grade, as we were in 6th grade, helped those of us who were a little bit behind 6th grade, although they were in 6th grade. And we made the whole thing work so that everybody got their 6th grade education. We got a practice in cooperation, both with our fellow students and with the teaching authority, who was really unable to do what was necessary. And it all worked out for everybody. Nothing that dramatic when I went on to Pius High School. It was another enjoyable experience. My wife and I, even though she was not a Pius student at any time, served on the reunion committee. And on the reunion committee for our 25th reunion, we had the privilege of calling and trying to locate, which was just a problem in itself, all of the fellow graduates. And we did get the number down to something like 15 people that we, out of a class of 380, that we were never able to locate. But it was really fun to get to talk to some of the people that we never knew, that I never knew when I was there. I knew who they were as they passed in the hall and so forth, but that we never spent any time together. And got a chance to talk to them on the phone and find out how things were going with them, and get their information down so that we could put it all together in a program book for the reunion. And the majority of them had had a similar experience to mine, and that they had good times to remember also. But we did encounter a few to whom their experience in high school had been nothing but totally negative, that they informed us that they never thought about those days. They never thought about Pius. They hated Pius. And that they would have nothing to do with any reunion. We could scratch them off the list and forget them. And that really made a bummer out of the occasional interview that went that way. But it didn't diminish the fact that all in all, we, as I say, had a great time bringing together the group, finding them, being able to convince many of them to at least give us a few notes on what their last 25 years had been like and where in life they were now. And it's something we were so glad that we had done, that we did it again for the 30th reunion and the 35th reunion and the 40th reunion. And I think we kind of stopped at that point because it was harder and harder to find people who had any interest in going back all the way 40 years because their lives had developed so much beyond that.
And could you tell us more about your college life?
Oh yeah, well I was a commuter student. That the real essential college life is something that I did not get to enjoy. Living in a dorm, eating at a commons. I would pack myself a lunch, jump on the bus, ride down to school, and if I didn't have an 8 o'clock class, which is when I usually got there, I would sit down at the Science Hall Lounge and join the bridge game, because there was a bridge game that started at 8 o'clock in the morning every day, and it ran until about 5 o'clock at night. And if someone had a class, they would get up, leave the bridge game, someone else would sit down, and the partnerships would be realigned and the game would go on. But there was always a bridge game going on. We had not much to do, well, we had nothing whatsoever to do with the sororities and fraternities since we weren't going to be living on campus, and that was just not going to work. And everybody that I hung around with, I think, was the first in their family to go to college. And so there were no legacy relationships that might have drawn us into that part of the existence. So what is a big part of the essence of college life to a lot of people is something we just pass by. That we went to class and we participated in some of the events. We were likely to go to basketball games quite a bit because Marquette had a good basketball team even then. And we would go to some of the school dances. because those were always very enjoyable occasions as well. And in a sense, you could almost say it continued in the same direction that high school had, that we were more committed to the idea of what it says in the brochure that college is about, namely an education. And having fun and going on spring break to some destination was something that never even entered our minds. As a matter of fact, it didn't enter the minds of most students back in late 50s and early 60s. So once again, we formed good friendships. We completed our education, and we felt that we were prepared to go out and face the world, and we did.
You talked about the bridge game. What was the bridge game?
Oh, bridge, if you're not familiar, is a game of cards. It's a four-handed game in which you're two sets of two partners. The rules are really quite simple, that the highest card of the suit led is going to take a trick. So each player will play one card to a trick, and whoever has the highest card in that suit that is played to that trick will win, unless a trump is played where one suit has been designated as the trump suit. So that will take precedence over anything else. And basically that's the rules. With that, you could actually sit down and play a game. The fact that you go into contract bidding gets to be a little bit more complicated.
And what other games or hobbies did you participate in your early life other than accordion? Or
Well, when I got into college, I also got into shooting a little bit of pool. And, well, I shot quite a bit of pool, and I became fairly decent at it, but it was never an outstanding skill with me, just enough to not look dumb at the table and to not get absolutely cremated every time I played somebody. I had a couple of friends who were a little better at it than me, and I learned quite a bit from them. But other card games also drew me besides bridge, and so being in Milwaukee, I was an avid sheep's head player and also played quite a bit of cribbage, and so those games I enjoyed. And of course, with Merrill Park Playground so close to my house, that by the time I was 8 years old, I was certainly going to be able to walk there alone, come home for lunch, go back after lunch, and come home for supper. And in the interim, play the usual softball, volleyball, occasional football game, and whatever else was going on, but never in an organized fashion, never in any kind of a competitive league. It was just not something that particularly interested me.
so you said you're 8 years old and you could run around everywhere. Was that common for all the other kids?
Yeah. That 35th Street at the time was one of the busiest streets in the city of Milwaukee. As a matter of fact, my paternal grandfather had been struck by an automobile and killed crossing the street. And I'm, in retrospect, really surprised that my parents gave me the freedom that they did. That freedom was limited by the fact that I never learned how to ride a bicycle. Still do not know how to do that to this day, because they were afraid that riding a bicycle on that busy street was going to be just too dangerous. And result of that is one of the little joys of childhood that I'm afraid passed me by. But I don't know where again we were going.
And what time did you have to come home?
Oh, came home for supper. And then after that, we were likely during the nice weather to go back up to the playground area. And there are still baseball and softball designated fields. And at the time, there were all kinds of organized softball leagues through the city. And again, those might be based on a tavern sponsoring a team, a parish sponsoring a team, a company sponsoring a team, and that they would compete and have their league championship. That'd be great. But they played games regularly at Merrill Park, and so we would go and sometimes watch the games. And in contrast to what happens at the professional stadium, if a foul ball is hit and you catch it, that's yours. With the softball leagues, if a foul ball was hit out of play and it was off the field, it was a matter of a race to see which of the 8 or 10 kids who were there with their folks watching the game, who could get to the foul ball first so that they would have the honor of throwing it back onto the field. There were no freebies. So we would then go home, and when that part of the entertainment diminished, and the whole family would be there at that point, and we would not sit down and watch television because there was no such thing.
Until?
That commercial television first came about when I was about 9 years old in 1948. And our grade school class, all about 25 of us, as a matter of fact, went as a group to Billy Fisher's house because they had a television set. And we all got to stand around in the living room and watch when President Truman was inaugurated. And actually, that would have been 49. He was elected in 48. So it was a big deal at that time. A year or so later, we did have a television in our house as well.
In color or in black and white?
Color? What's that? That did not come about until about I think it was about 1960. But everything was black and white, and the picture flipped, and there were lines across it that you could see, and it was really low res. And there was one channel, so you either turned on the TV or you didn't. You didn't flip channels. It was either channel 4 or off, and those were the only choices. And then gradually it started to fill up. Channel 6, channel 12 came around, and then the ultra high frequency set started to appear. The first group of channels, 2 to 13, that's all that you had in the entire country. But then the second bracket that went up from 13 and would have included our local channel 18, 24, 58, etc.
And what sort of shows or programs would you watch on Channel 4, like when you first got it, your television?
Another one of those strange things that we got to play the trick of the kid who had a TV for the inauguration of Harry Truman, was that we had a TV by the time the very first occasion came around that an entire Hollywood movie was going to be shown on a television station, and that was going to be the Saturday night entertainment on the only channel. And well, we invited the neighbors to come in, and we actually broke out a couple of quarts of soda for intermission, because there was an intermission. There were no interruptions for commercials, except a brief greeting at the beginning of the program. Then there was an intermission with exactly the idea that everybody who wants to can go to the bathroom or can go and get a drink and a snack, whatever is going to work. And there was a commercial at that point for the sponsor, which was Schlitz beer. And when the movie ended, there would be another commercial for Schlitz beer. So you had a 2-hour movie that was going to be run with one commercial at the beginning, end, and middle, 3 commercials, and only one commercial at each interruption. Not the thing you get now where there are usually 6 or 8 different spots that are to be enjoyed every time there's a break. But that was it. And as a matter of fact, the standard for television for quite a number of years after that was that there would be a commercial at the beginning of a half-hour show, interruption in the middle for one commercial from the sponsor, because it wasn't a matter of just running the show and interrupting it for half a dozen commercials. It was a particular sponsor would pick up the costs of producing the show and would therefore be the one and only who got to air a commercial during that show. And to me, much better arrangement, but the costs of running a show, of producing a show, are now quite a bit greater than they were then. So it started out pretty much where it still is, that there were some comedy shows, there were shoot-'em-ups, and mystery show. There were performances of plays that were condensed to an hour, usually, although there was one sponsored 90-minute drama, and what amounted to sitcoms, although that term was not used, they were there too, so that and news. I don't know, I think Channel 4, when we first got our TV set, the 10 o'clock news came on, and after that was a test pattern. And that would be, the test pattern would just be there. If you turned on your TV set, there was a test pattern. You could see, yep, my TV is working. I can see the picture, it's clear, everything's good. But that's all you'd have from then until about 6 o'clock in the morning. So.
And what sort of transportation did you and your family use before having a car?
Oh, as I was a child, we did not have a car. That we lived on, as I mentioned, on 35th Street, and a block from our house at St. Paul, there was a bus that came in from the west. That was the Clybourne Avenue bus, and that would be the way I would get down to Marquette University while I was a student there. The 35th Street bus itself ran all the way from Lincoln on the south up to Burleigh on the north, which was quite a haul. And it stopped at Lincoln because basically the world stopped at Lincoln Avenue. On 35th Street, there is now an overpass, the Jackson Park overpass, but that was not in existence. And so 35th Street came to an end about 2 blocks past Lincoln, and did not pick up again until Oklahoma Avenue. That geography has changed quite a bit. I mentioned my grandparents living around 53rd and Hampton. When we got off the Hampton Street bus to visit my grandparents on a Sunday afternoon, as we very frequently did, we would have to walk 2 blocks in from Hampton to get to their home. And as we did so, we would pass one house on our right and one house on our left. That was it. after their house, there were no more. There were open fields. And now you cannot place your foot anywhere that does not belong to somebody and constitute part of a lot that has a house built on it. That entire area is completely committed and well beyond it. It's not just to Hampton. Hampton is practically the middle of town these days. And Oklahoma Avenue, which as I kind of suggested might be a sort of an end of the world when I was a kid, beyond the transportation, public transportation which terminated at Lincoln. Oklahoma Avenue is, right in the middle of the city as far as most people are concerned. But at that time, it was pretty much the end of the world. From that point on, you were looking at farmland. So we rode the bus for several reasons. First of all, in the long run, it was more economical than having a car, taking care of the car and putting gas in the car. And the other one was that the buses came so often that it was almost silly to depend on a car. Because when we step out of our house, and if we saw the 35th Street bus go zipping by in front of us, it was not an, end of the world, I missed my bus, because I could turn and look down the street and see the next one.
Yeah, nowadays you have to wait 30 minutes for a bus.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if I didn't have the 35th Street bus coming immediately, I would probably be able to get started someplace, at least by taking the Clyburn bus. So I had options. Or go another 3 blocks up to Wisconsin Avenue. And there was this, I don't know, was Marquette High School, were you guys there?
There is a different location, I don't know where.
But in any event, the Route 30 and 31 buses ran past there, and you could get downtown pretty easily. And that was just 3 blocks from my house. So, yes, we could get anywhere and do it quickly and efficiently. And when I was 17, my dad bought a car finally.
And what car was that? Do you remember?
I think the first one was a Studebaker President, which was actually a pretty nice car. Studebaker, of course, has no existence these days. It was at the time kind of an off-brand. They talk about the big 3 at that time of General Motors, Chrysler, and American Motors. We had an American Motors plant here. Studebaker became part of American Motors at one time. Who am I missing? Ford. Oh, for goodness sake. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were the big 3. And Studebaker, Nash, Packard, a number of other brands still existed, but they didn't have long to live. And within about the next 10 years, it was just the big 3 and nothing else.
And with that car, you mentioned riding on the new highways with your friends?
Yes, that we would occasionally, as I indicated, with regard to our experiences with the, as I indicated talking to you, with our experiences with regard to the Milwaukee Braves, it was possible to find a little bit of give in the rules, and that people assumed that if you did something that was just a little bit off the track, that it didn't mean that it was your intention and your destiny to become a serial killer and a vandal of enormous proportions, but just that you were some kid goofing off and that it would get a pass. So what I had mentioned with regard to the Braves was that as I was coming home from high school at Pius XI, the streetcar that I would be riding went right past the stadium. And so I and a couple of friends of mine would get off the streetcar, and we would walk into the stadium grounds, which was a quarter mile, and the ushers would actually turn their backs as we approached, and we would walk in, and it would be about, school's over, be about the 6th inning, and we would walk in and see the last couple, 3 innings of the game. And this made Milwaukee Braves fans of us, and probably would have stayed that way forever if Lou Perini hadn't moved the team to Atlanta. But in any event, there was another one of those little things where, again, if anybody had seen you, they probably wouldn't bother because they don't think that you're there to steal the construction equipment or to do some harm to the roadway. But there were barricades so that you wouldn't drive onto the freeway as it was beginning to be constructed. And the first leg of I-94 in our area ran only from 13th Street to 68th Street. And we thought it was a terrible waste for that beautiful highway to be there, even for such a short distance. And so we would, from time to time, late at night, be inclined to move the barricades and drive onto the freeway and drive the full length of it and drive back. And it was really a kick where speed limits were 25 miles an hour anywhere else you were going to be driving in town, that we could kick it up to 55 miles an hour and rip down the freeway and rip back. And nobody ever bothered us, and we never did any damage. So, as I say, it was just a little bit more laid back. And that, I think, because nobody did anything terribly violent, or if they did from time to time occasionally, it was big news because that sort of thing didn't happen. Now when you get 17 people shot in one location after a basketball game and 4 more at the same time on the same night, it's something that is news for a few days and then is forgotten. We are so accustomed to it. I think I mentioned to you as we were talking earlier that in 1967, when we had some riots with racial overtones in the Milwaukee area and in much of the country, that we actually had, at that time we lived on 24th Place and Nash Street. It's 3 blocks south of Capitol Drive. And the National Guard was called in to quiet things down in Milwaukee. And from where we lived, we could look 3 blocks north and see the National Guard installation, and we could look 3 blocks west and see the National Guard. We were on the inside looking out. That part of town was quarantined, and for several days we were completely quarantined. Then after that there was a break where you could have several hours that the gates were open. You could go out, run some errands, do some grocery shopping, come back in. But for about a week, the entire area that was as far out as Capitol Drive and as far as the Menominee River was barricaded, and the National Guard was in charge.
In your knowledge and experience, could you explain your experiences and what caused the riot to happen?
Well, we weren't too much concerned about that. It was just a matter of, no, I guess I would have to really stop and think about that. I'm
Blockbusting, redlining?
Yeah, well, that was certainly part of it. I don't think that the riots were just triggered by that, but that was a practice that was very prevalent. But the other point that I was going to make about it is that during that period of time when we were sequestered within the borders of the National Guard. There was an incident about 3 blocks from our home, and we could hear the gunfire at that time. And that, for me, that was a real startling event. It was the first time in my life, at the age of about 27 or 8, I think, that I had ever heard gunfire occur in anger. Yeah, I had some friends who owned guns, and I had the opportunity to shoot a bit, but never to hear a weapon actually being used with the intention of harming another person. And since then, I have gotten to meet and talk to and work with a number of people whose background has been quite a bit different from mine, and whose experiences in life have not been as easygoing, and to whom hearing gunfire at night, okay, that's Tuesday, so what's Thursday? It's probably going to be the same thing. And it is something that a person, I don't think, will ever get used to. I hope to God not. But that is sort of on the border of that it has become so commonplace in our community that there are areas and there are people who have such a degree of unsafe existence and feeling that that is caused by the fact that they do hear that noise that I've only heard once regularly. The redlining and the blockbusting was the fact that at that time there was a very strong enclave motivation that we live in here, they live out there, or we live out there and they live in here would be more accurate. And if a white person sold their property to a black person, they would not leave that neighborhood with friends. That they were the ones who had opened the neighborhood, had opened the street to the other. And that was, by definition, a bad thing to do. There were no laws guaranteeing open housing. There was no law that says if I had a rental property that I couldn't rent it only to people of my ethnicity if I chose. The law now says if you have a place to rent and somebody comes with cash in their hand and can pay the rent, unless you have some real legitimate reason, as for example, they tell you that they're going to be opening a car theft ring next door, well, you probably couldn't even get away with it then. But if a person can pay the rent the property to them, sell the property to them if they have the money to buy it, they are certainly going to be an asset to their community, to your community, and to your street. But a blockbuster was the person who sold that first house, the realtor who sold that first house, and they would therefore have broken the block. And from that point on, white flight would take place, and other houses would go up for sale, and it would not be that hard to get the second owner to sell. And after that, though, and that would be great, but after that, the entire block would suddenly become African American, because at that point, the whites wanted to get out. And so the realtors would have a field day. They would have a feast. They would sell every house on that block, turn it over at least once. and then move on to the next block. At the same time, the restriction that occurred on this whole practice was that of redlining. And that meant that the banks would join in the control of fair housing. And I don't know what's fair about it when your tactic is that you refuse to give a loan to the African American individual, even if they were qualified. And so within this district, yes, but outside of this district, no. So there was a red line drawn, and you could write a loan inside. You couldn't write the loan outside. You didn't write the loan outside. So this was a way to keep Milwaukee one of the most segregated communities in the country. And I believe it still has that qualification, but it is nowhere near as much so as it was. The near absolute quality of it, the possibility of simply drawing lines and saying this, yes, that, no, that's pretty much gone.
Would you also like to talk about any other experiences, such as the 1947 snowfall?
Oh yeah, well, everybody talks about that. That was fun. That was a far less serious and much more enjoyable circumstance. That in January of 1947, we had 3 solid days of snow, by the end of which the city was absolutely paralyzed. The one thing you could always count on in a snowfall was that the buses would still be running through. The snowplows would be efficient enough to keep the streets clear enough that although most cars were probably not going to make it all the way from here to there, they would hit some spot that the plows had missed. The buses could work their way through, and they would get you and their other passengers through from where you were to where you wanted to be. The buses were completely stopped, and that in itself was an event. It just didn't happen. On that occasion, it did. Nothing in the city was moving. And that to us was a joyous occasion, because one of the things that we were just so tired of hearing, now stay out of the street, now you be careful, don't you go out in the street. And on that occasion, we were encouraged by our parents to go out in the street and build a snow fort, build a snowman, do whatever, have a snowball fight. And the street became a playground. And not only a playground, but a playground that was up beyond our hips in snow. And it lasted for 3 days, and after the snowfall was complete, and it was a joyous occasion.
And something joyous that you also experienced would be the victory over Japan Day. Could you explain that?
That's one of my earliest memories. I would have been 6 when VJ Day, Victory over Japan, took place. VE Day had already occurred. My recollection is that was not as big, anywhere near as big an event, and justly so, because although the war in Europe was over at that point, VE was victory in Europe, it still wasn't ended, and there still was the war in the Pacific, and our fight with Japan had yet to be settled. And it was about 4 months, as a matter of fact, from the end of one to the end of the final. So VJ Day hit, and once again the streets were largely non-existent. That yes, people were driving cars down the streets and tooting their horns and cheering and waving to everybody they passed. There was nobody there who was not your friend. Everybody was greeting everybody else. Common to see people giving complete strangers a hug, that it was over. And it had been 4 very difficult years of getting along without here so that the war effort could be continued. We collected empty steel cans and we cleaned them out and prepared them for being sent to the steel mills and being reprocessed into new steel that could be turned into who knows what, perhaps a rifle, perhaps a battleship. But everything that could be used was used. If we had some pork for dinner, we would save the grease from the pork, and that would go towards the war effort, that it might become lubricant for a Jeep, or it might become something that was used to lubricate the machines in a manufactory of ammunition, but it would be used. If you had money, and by this time the Depression was long over and everybody did have money, and you wanted to buy some gasoline for your car, not a problem with us since we didn't have one. You couldn't buy gasoline unless you also had stamps to go with it, ration stamps. So everything was rationed. Sugar was rationed, meat was rationed. If you wanted to buy consumables in general, you had to have the proper ration stamps as well as the money, or you simply couldn't make the transaction. So we were living constantly with an awareness of the fact that we were at war. And everything was centered around it, and to carry out the necessary moves that we could possibly make at home to help it. People had victory gardens. So in order to increase the food supply that was available, because we were not only feeding ourselves and our troops overseas, but we were feeding our allies and their troops. And we were not only the ammunition and source of equipment, we were manufacturing airplanes by the tens of thousands, where they had talked about hundreds before the war started. And we were providing arms, munitions. Everything was aimed towards the war effort. And now all of a sudden it was over. And VJ Day was, hey, cut loose. Finals are over. You don't have to go to class anymore. There is nothing more that you have as an obligation tonight except to celebrate. And everybody did.
And how were heroes welcome?
Oh, there is another sore story, and that is that the heroes were welcomed unreservedly. That any place a veteran went, any place somebody went in uniform that you could recognize him, if he walked into a bar, he could not buy a drink because his money was no good. Everybody would buy him a drink. If he needed a ticket to a show, here, I have a ticket, it's yours. And there was nothing that you could do for a man in uniform that you wouldn't do. And there were cheers and there were parades in every city and town. There were bands that were leading the cheers. There was, you name it, anything that could be done to celebrate the return of our soldiers from overseas. It was done. I had 3 uncles who served, one in the Pacific, 2 in Europe, and they all came back, which was a blessing. There were way too many homes where you saw a blue star in the window that meant there was somebody in the service. There was overseas. What you didn't want to see was a gold star, which meant they had someone in their family had paid the ultimate price, that they had a death from the fight. And there was some soldier who was not going to come home. But it was something that demanded and received the ultimate respect that someone had served. And what I mentioned about there also being a sore story there is the contrast from there to Vietnam, where the most fortunate thing that a soldier coming back could expect and hope for was to be ignored. And that people would express their hatred for the war, their unwillingness to admit that there could be some virtue to serving your country, even if I didn't agree with it, but that the veterans coming home from Vietnam received no respect whatsoever. There were no bands playing. There were no parades. As I say, the best they ever got was to be ignored.
Did you know anyone in the Vietnam War?
Yes. I had a cousin who fought in Vietnam. He was injured when a mortar round hit the place where he was sandbagged, and it thought that there was, you're never going to be completely safe in a war zone. He thought that it was as safe as any place was going to be that he could be standing, but he knew that every moment he was under attack. And it hit the place where he was, and he was badly injured. His hip was broken, a few other things. And he, however, did come home. So we thank God for that. And I also had a friend. We had gone through high school together and had gone to Marquette together. And he spent two tours of duty in Nam. He was there first he was an electronic engineer. He had helped in setting up the communication system at Da Nang, which was a big Air Force base in Vietnam that for the United States. And at a later time, he went back for another tour where he was in command of a rifle company. So if you wanted to be promoted at that time, you were going to have to be out in the field. And so he had volunteered for a rifle company, and he is by that time had already the rank of captain. And so he retired as a lieutenant colonel. And so I'm happy with the fact that both of the people that I was really close to who served over there came home. But it was a bad circumstance all the way around. Much different from the first case.
And to bring it back a little bit, can you tell us about your experience in Milwaukee during the Korean War or the Cold War?
Well, during the Korean War, while it was hot, at the end, when before the agreement to the armistice was signed, there were some ridiculous things that happened. They spent months and months arguing about the shape of the table that the peace talks were going to take place on. They did not proceed to do any talking until that was settled. Where it was going to be was a matter that took an ungodly amount of time to settle first. Then what was the structure of the building going to be? And I would never have thought of it, but I guess a legitimate question for the other side was that Westerners in general tend to be physically quite a bit larger than Asiatics in general. And they argued for a long, long time, both sides, as to what was going to be the structure of the, what was going to be the seating arrangements for the peace talks. And the North Koreans and the Chinese were concerned that they did not want to have the Americans looking down at them. They did not want themselves, even worse, to be looking up at the Americans. The Americans, on the other hand, did not want to be giving them special chairs. So both sides dug their heels in and fought over that for, again, I don't know how long, but the matter was finally settled, and they did finally sit down and work their way to a ceasefire and ended it, at least from a hot war standpoint. My interest in it was when it first happened, when the whole thing started, was that the newspaper published a map of the Korean Peninsula showing where the action was and where the particularly violent stories of the day had occurred. And I was interested in the geography of it and seeing where, with there being hills and even mountains involved, that how that would, and rivers, that these would tend to delineate fields of action and targets for occupation that would be advantageous to this side, that side, both sides. And so I watched the progress of the war on a daily basis from the maps that were published, and as well as from the news that was broadcast and in the papers. But it was academic. I was only watching that, not because at the age of 11, 12, 13, 14, I expected to have any likelihood of going there, but just because it was what was important that was going on in the world right now. And maps had always fascinated me anyhow.
And that's how you got a hobby into it during the time?
Kind of, yeah. That, amongst other things, I collected road maps that you could walk into a gas station virtually anywhere and request a road map, they give it to you. And so you could get a map of Wisconsin, of course, very easily, but Illinois, Michigan, Iowa, these were easy to come by, but occasionally you would find a place that had a map of someplace a little bit more distance. And if you were really fortunate, you might pick up one that nobody else you knew had, a map of Ontario, for example. So I collected those. And maps, just simply map reading and knowing where places were and what they were like, what kind of products were likely to be mined or raised or manufactured in this country, that country, all over the world, and just to see how far things might have come before they reached the store where I could buy them.
And later on, during the Vietnam War, did you ever receive a draft notice? And
I did. And the response to the draft notice, and many of the people who got one were to go to Canada, where they were permitted to enter and were protected. They were not going to be returned to the United States. Or Sweden was the other favorite place to go. And I was not in love with the idea of going to Vietnam. But I felt that if the blocks were put to me and I was told I had to go, I would go. That it would be my duty to do so, and it would be very. I would do so unwillingly, but I would do so. And as it turned out, when my draft notice arrived, I had graduated from college, and I was working for a company here in town. And we had two contracts that were particularly, or three actually, that were particularly of interest to me, two of them that pertained directly to the military, and one of them that was simply that had importance to it. And the one that taking the last one first was that we were working with the Mayo Clinic on the isolation of some hormones that were thought to have possible use in treating cancer. And we, at the company where I worked, would do a crude separation of the hormone from not the most likable raw material that I ever got the privilege of working with, but postmenopausal female urine. And we would process it from 5-gallon carboys down to being a few handsful of a powdered substance that we would be able to send to the Mayo Clinic, and that they would carry out the real high quality further purification and then the research that was being done with it. But we had determined where we had an opportunity to get a continuing supply of the appropriate urine, and so our company had bid on a contract and got to do it, and I was put in charge of it. And the other two, which had a more military aspect, were that we worked with a company as subcontractors, and the thrust of their contract was to try to find a replacement for Agent Orange. Agent Orange was used widely in Vietnam as a defoliant. So part of the problem in carrying out the fighting there was that the jungle provided an automatic hiding place for the enemy, for the Viet Cong. And it was possible for them to carry out extensive movements under the cover of the canopy of the jungle, and we would not know where they were or what they were doing. And if we could stop the jungle from growing, then we would erase that advantage and be able to see where our targets were. So Agent Orange was the defoliant that was used as a matter of choice, but it was recognized that it was not only potentially something that would remain there beyond the time of its usefulness, and number two, that it could be harmful to human beings. And so to find a replacement for it was a priority. And the company that had the contract worked out the synthesis of the compounds of interest, and then they sent us the methodology, and we designed the equipment that could carry out the necessary reaction. Had to be done in a agitated vessel at a controlled elevated temperature, and it had to be able to withstand considerable pressure, and so that the equipment was very particular. And that was my project also. The company was located north of Green Bay, worked out the initial method of synthesizing the chemicals of interest, and we had the system for doing it in substantially larger quantities. I don't think we ever made a whole pound of anything, but you didn't need that much to carry out tests. And the third item was that we were carrying out testing of aircraft components, electronic equipment that would be going into airplanes and helicopters, which were used extensively in the Vietnam conflict. So we were testing their reliability under conditions of high humidity and higher temperatures than what we are accustomed to here. So it turned out that that was enough of a resume that almost as fast as I got a draft notice, I also got a classification as defense essential.
And that was the reason why you were exempt from military service?
And that meant I was not to go overseas, but I was to remain in my job, and that was my service.
And after your job at that company, which is there a name for that company? Or?
I was American Biosynthetics Corporation.
And after that company, what job did you take, and how old were you when you took that?
I would have been 27 when I started at Millprint, and Millprint was a manufacturer of flexible packaging materials. And so we would take the material that we were starting with. There would be paper, polyethylene, foil, cellophane, and whatever was the structure that a manufacturer wanted for his product, largely consumer products, that we would carry out the print job, and then we would laminate the films as needed. So it might be that a reflective piece that was with a high impact on the passerby in a store might want it to be packaged in metallized mylar, which is a very, very thin coating of aluminum on a mylar film, and it shines like a mirror. And so, yeah, that has a lot of visual appeal. It bangs your eye when you walk by it. Or the yellow that was Oscar Mayer's trademark on their packaged meats. They used it on bacon, they used it on bologna, they used it, especially bologna, and quite a number of others. And so we could make the films and print them, and we could match the colors of the inks that were going to be used, and put together all of the constructs that were going to be required. I got to use quite a few, and this is one of the nice things about being a chemist, is that you get to be familiar with the jargon. And I could say that one of my specialties was working with the Fourier transform infrared spectrophotometer. And most people can't understand what the heck I'm saying, and it really sounds impressive. But it's something we just did every day and got used to.
And after milk print, you worked in malted milk. Could you explain that?
Well, Kurth Malting Corporation was a maker of malt. Malt is a very simple product. You take barley and you give it conditions under which it is going to grow, but you don't put it in the ground. You keep it in a compartment, and that compartment may be 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, and contain 3,000 bushels of barley. And you keep it moist, and you keep it from getting too warm, because as things grow, they produce heat. And normally that's not a problem. If you have a seed in the ground and you have one seed in 10 pounds of dirt, it's not going to warm up the dirt, no matter how hard you try. But if you bring 10 pounds of the seed together and give it the moisture that it needs and start it growing, it will actually develop a sensible amount of heat in the center of it. So you have to be careful not to let it get too hot. You have to be careful not to let it get dry. You have to keep it mixed. And when you're done, which is only about 5 days, you then dry it by putting it onto another compartment that is of similar size and shape, and burn gas underneath it and let the hot gas rise through it and dry it. One of the things that went with that was that a tradition of treating malt that has been known for centuries is to burn sulfur underneath it in addition to the gas. And that the sulfur dioxide fumes rising up through the malt as it dries bleach it and have a salutary effect upon freeing the enzymes that are what you're really after in growing the malt, so that it will digest any other grain that you put in with it and provide food and also a substrate to grow on for the yeast that you are ultimately going to throw into it to make beer. And we made some pretty good beer. As a matter of fact, it was my job at Kurth Malt to drink beer, because if you didn't know whether your malt was going to develop sufficiently that you could make a good beer out of it, you did not have a product. So you had to give it a pedigree and say, yes, this has been tested. We have made beer out of this malt. Yes, it does the job. There's also different requirements for the different brewers. So Anheuser-Busch wanted to have a very pale malt with a very low bacteria count. Pabst didn't care about that, so long as they could control the color of the beer. Schlitz wanted to get more beer out of every pound of malt that they bought, and so you had to balance the product, therefore, to satisfy the customer. Pretty much the same as it is in any manufacturing arrangement. I left Kurth Malt ultimately because I did not really think I wanted to devote the rest of my life to making a good beer. Although there is virtue in that, But there had to, oh, I did want to finish the thought of burning the sulfur underneath the malt as it was drying, because there was a considerable project that I worked on there with the leader of the group, and that was to stop doing that, because burning 300 pounds of sulfur underneath a kiln of malt, the malt would not absorb it all, and you'd be throwing hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sulfur dioxide ultimately into the atmosphere. We wanted to get rid of that, and we succeeded. That we found that we could, without hurting the malt, without hurting the beer that was going to be made from the malt, without having any deleterious effects upon the consumer, that we could form the sulfur dioxide within the kernel by treating it first with sodium bisulfite and then spraying it with sulfuric acid as it was going to the kiln. And it generated its own sulfur dioxide, bleached itself, and saved us from burning all of that sulfur that was otherwise just going to go into the atmosphere and be dissipated. By itself, Kurth malt was not going to move the needle very much, but other maltsters took up this process also, and it became general. And we did ultimately take a considerable amount of sulfur dioxide. So my job wouldn't necessarily only have been to make a better bottle of beer. It also had some impact on the environment, and I'm rather pleased with that.
And your next job after working for?
I think we got to mill print.
Yeah, your job.
And one of the things I want to go into there too is that, very briefly, that those yellow pigments that I was talking about, the very bright, very opaque yellow, unfortunately, the pigment was lead chromate. And lead chromate, lead is poisonous, chromate is poisonous. Put them together and you don't get dessert. So we found a replacement for that. And that was one of the things that we worked on quite a bit. Also cutting down on the amount of solar active solvents that we put into the atmosphere. So the toluene was a particular problem, and that it was famous for being a major part of the generation of smog in California. And we found a replacement. We worked out a replacement for toluene that could do the job that we needed, because it was an excellent solvent. And we got something that could match it, and that the effects on the solar radiation were not a problem. So that once again we got to do something that was more truly useful than improving the color of a package. But aside from that, my next place gave me even more direct contact with that, and that was at Summer Fry Laboratories, and that morphed into SF Laboratories, then into SF Analytical, and finally it was bought out by a European outfit whose name is Eurofins, and now it is Eurofins SF. So, but it's still in existence. And all of the other companies, all of the other laboratories that were our competitors, and this was in the early 70s and forward, went out of business. Some of them had much better funding, much better equipment, more impressive sounding titles for their staff, and they all failed, and the company that I was working for is still there, and I take some pride in that too.
And what did you do at Summer Fry Laboratories?
Well, we had several groups, and one group was strictly the analysis of wastewater from manufacturing and processing plants in southeastern Wisconsin. Another was allied to that and was the testing of wastewater to see whether it would kill organisms that would be trying to live in the water to which the wastewater was being discharged. So that if we could show that their wastewater was treated to an extent that it was no longer going to be killing the organisms that we used for testing, that would give them a satisfactory reading from the Department of Natural Resources. And all of our water testing was done under the aegis of the Department of Natural Resources. We raised fish. Fathead minnows were the primary species that was used for testing the wastewater, and if they could live in it, that was a pass. If they died, that was a failure. Cereodaphnia was the smaller invertebrate that was also used, and that also got tested, and that was in our bioassay division. Microbiology was a large division of the company, still is, and it was not the largest. It is not the largest now. It was back in the day. And there we dealt with the common pathogens that might be found and involved in food poisoning. And with qualification of products that would be safe to eat. Every once in a while you read about one of these product recalls, and 100,000 pounds of hamburger has been called back, and that might have been our laboratory that did the testing that led to that. And we talked about another thing. I will digress, and that is that you wondered if I had ever run into any celebrities in the course of my travels, and there's one I never ran into, but I still got, in a sense, to touch, and that was Fred Miller of the Miller Brewing Company. And Fred Miller died in a plane crash. And it was back way before I was involved. I think it was in the 1950s. And by the time I was involved, it was way into the 1970s, possibly 1980s. And that was that someone had a theory as to what might have brought down the airplane that he was in. And they sent us a sample of a plastic part that was supposed to be nylon. And they wondered if it really was, and they had some indications by the examination of it by an expert who said there was no way that was nylon, and that a molded part like that wouldn't be made of nylon. And so they sent it to our laboratory and asked to have it tested. And the result of it was that I ran an infrared spectrophotometric scan, as I was mentioning earlier. And it was nylon. And I could specify, as a matter of fact, which of the several types of most common nylon plastics are, and removed any doubt of the fact that, hey, this was not what killed the guy. So in a sense, although I never met him, never shook his hand, never touched anything that he had had any experience with until he was 15 or 20 years dead, I claim that I do have a contact with Fred Miller. But in any event, that goes into the last thing that we did at SF Analytical, and that was the division which I was. And because basically what it was that with all of the other things that we did, pure water, wastewater, microbiology, bioassay, food analysis, that you pick up a package of snack items and you get the rundown on it as to what is the content of it for moisture, protein, fat, ash, fiber. It's a good chance that Eurofins SF did that work. And anything that didn't fit into those categories, that came across my desk. And one of the things that I started to do a lot of was analysis of fine chemicals that were going to be used in the production of drugs. So not the drugs themselves, but for pharmaceutical concerns, the raw materials that would go into their production of drugs have to themselves be tested to see to it that they meet purity standards. And so we started doing that kind of work. And that now is the largest single area of work that Eurofins SF does. And it's the sort of thing that in a laboratory you have to be aware of is going to likely take place and could at any time, because the place started out as being primarily a grain analysis laboratory, then a leather analysis laboratory, then a meat scraps analysis laboratory, and then got into the 5 divisions that I was speaking of in between, and concentrated more on now the analysis of production chemicals that are going to be used in pharmaceuticals.
And for how long did you work there until?
I worked there for 45 years. I started there in 1973 and finally retired in 79 and had almost completed 1 more year.
In 2019 you retired?
Yes.
Okay. So would you like to show us some artifacts that you brought in?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, on the matter of did I ever run into any celebrities? And that, yes, there was another one that I actually did get to shake the hand of, and that was Governor Lee Dreyfus. That in addition to my vocation as an analytical and consulting chemist, my avocation was as an actor. And the groundwork for that, as I already mentioned, was with the group that my dad and some of his co-workers organized to go around the city entertaining. And the Sunset Playhouse was my principal home, but I performed in quite a number of other venues as well. And one of the shows that I did was A Man for All Seasons, the story of St. Thomas More. It is probably the only real, honest, serious drama, historical drama, that I had the opportunity to work in. I worked more in comedy, farce, drama, whodunits. One of my accomplishments was to be the lead actor in Agatha Christie's Witness for the Prosecution. And I did that for the patio players out in Menominee Falls. And I also, I wouldn't really count it on my resume if I were writing one up, had an occasion when I happened to be there at a show where one of the actors got sick, And that actor had only one thing to do, and that was to bring a tray with a pitcher and drinks on it and put it down to where two of the major actors were in conversation. And I don't even know whether that had any significance if I was delivering the poisoned murder weapon or what I was doing. But my buddy just told me, hey, carry this out, put it on a stage, and get back in here as fast as you can. And so I did. So from the ridiculous to the sublime, I got to do a little bit of everything. I told myself as I got into the area that after my first half dozen or so shows, I've come to realize I will never be singing in one of these shows. I will never be dancing in one of these shows, and I'm never going to get the girl. And then 2 shows later, I was singing, I was dancing, and I got the girl. So you never know what's going to happen. That was a musical comedy, as a matter of fact. It was Of Thee I Sing. And my character was the vice president, Alexander Throttlebottom. And he was rather a pathetic character. After all, that's what vice presidents were for the most part, that the president, everybody was fixated on the president, and nobody knows the name of the vice president, and that was my role. So, but I did actually get to sing a solo at the Sunset Playhouse and survived to tell about it. In any event, Governor Dreyfus probably would not have come to see the show if it hadn't been a serious historical drama. And so we had the joy of his presence, and I got to shake hands with him, talk it over. He had some kind words for my performance, much less than that of taking the lead in witness for the prosecution. But it was really, I think, the best play, the best directed, the best performed overall, and the highest class play that I was ever in. And the governor was very gracious.
Would you like to share some photos of that play? If you have any? Or any that you would
I
like to share?
don't think I have. Do we have? Yes, I have one, not from that play, but from a far less dignified play. If you can get it, that's me. And my character, who made a big thing of the fact that his last name was Cohen with a K. And the point of that was that this was in Germany, and even in the late 1800s in Germany, being a Jew was not exactly the best social background if you wanted to be a success in life. Cohen with a C would be, of course, a Jew, and I was trying to hide the fact. Cohen with a K could be anything. So he was a barber, and the play was The Underpants, and it was written by a name you will be familiar with. Most of the plays have been involved people whose names you won't immediately recognize, but the author was Steve Martin, and nobody in the play wore an arrow through his head, but we might just as well have, because it was really farce, and good farce.
Would you like to talk about the picture you showed us before about getting the names wrong?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I don't know if you can get tight enough for this one, but this picture is of me at 11 with a black eye, makeup, of course. And I was delivering that commercial I think I mentioned for the LaDuca Brothers organization at their annual concert. And the picture is that was my first year on the faculty. I have a picture of that too. I had become a music teacher at the age of 16. And the requirement for me to get the job was that I would have to wear a sport coat and a tie when I showed up to be a teacher, because parents would never be able to take me seriously as a 16-year-old kid teaching their magnificent son or daughter. The teaching job, by the way, was a real joy, because I felt sometimes that I was cheating by getting paid for it. The kids were all great. Their parents were supportive. And the moment when a kid stops reading the music and trying to make his fingers do what the music says, and instead actually plays a song, is a kick that you just don't get anywhere else. It's just seeing that light come on and seeing that somebody can do something that they couldn't do before. And one last picture, I think. There's a picture of me, and I know you're not going to be tight enough to see that the name underneath that picture is not Ed Carroll, but it is Ed Cladil. Coincidentally, Ed Cladil was my teacher, and his picture should have been over his name, or my name should have been under my picture, but it didn't turn out that way. There's another fellow over here, and he does have the name Ed Carroll under his picture. I can't even remember his name now. That's almost 70, well, it's more than 70 years ago. And he never got his name there. He got his picture there. Eddie Cladil never got his picture there. He got his name there. I got both my name and my picture in the program, but they were both in the wrong place. So I borrow from Rodney Dangerfield and say, I can't get no respect. You high school students won't get that.
And as the interview's coming to a close, what do you like to let the people who are watching this know anything about? Let them know anything you want.
Well, I don't think I have much more to add. Just that the things that have been most important throughout my life, I'm actually, as I've considered this and looked into some of these things, I never really thought that much. But that music, which not only got me through Marquette University and got me a wife and children and grandchildren, has been as important in my life as it actually turns out. Now that I think about it, it is. And that if you can find something that is a real passion that you really enjoy doing, that really draws you, and that you really want to continue doing, I guess the thing to do is to seize onto it and make sure you bring yourself as much into it as you can. And that I've had many rewarding days as a chemist, and I've had many rewarding days as an actor, and as a musician. And the most of all, of course, have been those rewarding days with my family. I think that sums it up.
Thank you. This has been the Milwaukee Memory Project, and we thank you for letting us know about your history and the history of Milwaukee. Thank you.
Thank you for asking me.